if there's been one theme that has gone through Negro history, it has been this theme of freedom, of equality, of America standing up and living up to the bright promises of the Declaration of Independence. This, too, is the essential American theme. There is no theme in Negro life that is not a theme in American life, because the Negro is America, too. He is completely integrated.
Professor Benjamin
history.
Quarles, distinguished historian of Negro history, speaks with students of the Detroit Public Schools in a series of talks on the Negro American.
I think it is worth noting because, as I've indicated, the Negro is a mainstream figure, and sometimes we do not get a full sense of his role in our past. Many of us teach courses in American history where some of this information can be woven in most casually, but it would be an eye-opener to the student because the record is there, the record of the Negro in the Revolution. Now, I need not say that ideas come before action, and therefore when the American Revolution breaks out, the preparation had been a long time in coming in the ideas of the philosophers of the Enlightenment, Voltaire and Diderot and Montesquieu, Rousseau. All of these great thinkers, the founding fathers, knew these thinkers very well. And basically on John Locke, who in 1688, the contract theory, if the king breaks a contract, the king does not rule by divine right, he rules by contract, and if he breaks the contract, you have a right of revolution. Now the founding fathers, the people who broke with England, they were familiar with this rich intellectual heritage of the Enlightenment. And they're going to use this against George III. And therefore, when they get ready to break with the mother country, for a number of reasons which you teach, I know, they get the intellectual argument against the mother country. This was the intellectual undergirding of the American Revolution, based on the theory of natural rights. All men are created equal. Now, this is revolutionary language. And when a revolution breaks out, you can't say to a revolution, stop here. Stop here. You can't say to a revolution, this is just against England. A revolution is a two-edged sword. It's always an internal revolution, because what do apprentices, indentured servants, what do slaves say if they hear this revolutionary language? In fact, when we read the Declaration of Independence, we better tell people what we're reading because they'll think it's subversive, really. You know, it sounds really, doesn't it? It sounds left-wing. Really, I'm quoting people from the Declaration of Independence, really. Yes, I'm deeply patriotic. We take an oath where I come from, oath of allegiance to the United States. So that I'm quoting from the Declaration. Now, this is revolutionary language. So that the American Revolution was also, as Jameson points out, a social revolution, an internal revolution. Those who were unfree got hold of these great slogans. Give me liberty or give me death, said Patrick Henry, although he confessed slavery was wrong. He couldn't do it without the convenience, nevertheless. Give me liberty or give me death. Very great phrase, you see. So this is revolutionary language. Now, this revolutionary language was transferred to those who were not free within colonial America, within the early days, so that this was a tremendous document. I need not say the influence of it in the European revolutions of 1848 and in the 20th century revolutions in Asia and Africa. Jefferson, he may have been all wrong. Everything he may have said, that all men are created equal, which is entirely theoretical. The question is not whether he was wrong or not. It's a question whether people believed him. And people believed in these great affirmations. And the slave believed in these affirmations. So that the whole spirit of the Declaration of Independence, this would automatically undermine such an institution of slavery. Now, the Negro gets into the Revolution, almost backs into it. I may just mention one early episode, because it's a famous episode in our history. It created the mindset against England, and that was the famous Boston Massacre on March 5th, 1770. Now, only 5 men were killed in this Boston Massacre, but you know, saying it might get killed in an automobile accident, 5 men, but you call it a massacre. You're getting up public opinion against the mother country. So you call this a massacre, Boston Massacre. Wonderful propaganda. Now, but these are great ideas, however, but in this so-called Boston Massacre on this night around 9 o'clock, frosty night in Boston. The British soldiers, in a moment of panic, they were stationed in Boston and resentment. They fired in the crowd, and 5 men were to die, and they would be buried on that Thursday with great ceremony from the Granary Burying Ground in Boston. They would be put in a common grave. Now, one of these 5 men was Crispus Attucks, and he was the only one buried from famous Faneuil Hall because he had no background. We don't know anything about Crispus Attucks until that very moment in history when he was killed. We don't know a thing about him. 100 years later, a man going through a newspaper saw a statement that a slave had escaped in 1750, and the slave sounded like Crispus Attucks, looked like, so we surmise that Crispus Attucks escaped from slavery in 1750. But in 1770, in Boston, on the night of March 5th, he was there. He actually died first. He expired first. He was the first to die. The record is very clear on that. Now, one of the reasons that Crispus Attucks emerges so famously from history was an unfortunate indication of race feeling on the part of our great president, second president, John Adams. John Adams defended the British soldiers. The British soldiers had a very good defense. In fact, they're going to get off free, as you know, but the colonists don't object so much. They have the martyrs, although the soldiers, so they have the martyrs. But in defending the British soldiers, John Adams appealed to race prejudice, and he said to the jury, supposing you were a British soldier, and this mob led by Crispus Attucks, a fierce-looking mulatto, was bearing down on you with a big stick. So he made Crispus Attucks the villain, which was really the hero. Crispus Attucks, in fact, there's a Crispus Attucks Day every year proclaimed in Massachusetts. You know, there's a big square where Crispus Attucks fell, you know, in Boston. Oh, Boston goes all out for this business, you know. So Crispus Attucks emerges. But what Crispus Attucks was doing there, sometimes when we say we don't know what he was doing there, he might have been interested in freedom. He might have been just interested in excitement. Now, sometimes we have Negro writers who say he was there because he was interested in liberty. Now, that's all right if you're dealing at certain levels. But where are the documents? We know he was there. He did die first. He was buried from Faneuil Hall. It was a great propaganda every year. The colonists used March 5th until they had July the 4th. He has a great fame, tremendous fame, but sometimes our writers will go a little too far. Now, they're not responsible to professional readers or people like you. So they go, Crispus Attucks was dying for freedom, which he didn't have. Well, we don't know why Crispus Attucks died, but we do know he died. So that what he was doing there now, he might have been, as I say, we don't know. He might have been impressed by this. There's no reason to believe he wasn't. But the point is, the first man to die, now most historians consider the Boston Massacre the opening salvo of the American Revolution, which breaks out 5 years later at Concord and Lexington. So that it is significant that in this whole, the first to die, Negroes been the first to die in World War II and so forth, so that Crispus Attucks does symbolize the role of the Negro, of course, in the whole revolution. Now, when the Revolutionary War breaks out, Negroes take part in the first actions in Boston, at Lexington and Concord. We have a record of Negroes actually being there. George Washington and the new state governments, Continental Army under Washington, the state governments, did not want Negroes in the army. There's always opposition to using Negroes. Every war we've ever been in until the 20th century. You try to say the war can be fought without the Negro because you don't want the war to change the status of the Negro. The war will change it. And you've built up the idea that the Negro is not a fighting man, he's a laboring man. He owes service to somebody, which he did. Now, you will disturb those labor relations if this man becomes a warrior. So in our wars, there's generally been, until the 20th century, a reluctance to use the Negro, colonial wars, but inevitably the shortage of manpower. It's less dangerous to arm the Negro and change his status than to lose a war. And we never lost a war. That is, a war to an outside enemy, a war between North and South, somebody did, but we never lost a war. So that you always, and this is invariable, as a last resort, you think the war will be over. We Americans always think the war will be over the next month because we're in it. It's going to be over. When it doesn't get over, then we have to rethink and reassess. Well, the same thing happened in the American Revolution. For over a year, you barred Negroes, and then beginning in 1777, the states, which had their own state armies, imagine, state had its army, state had its own navy, imagine. We sometimes run wars, so you wonder how we ever won, don't you? But at any rate, the states began to reverse their policy, and they began to accept Negroes. And then the Continental Army, which had to take whomever it could get, whomever the state sent it, the states began to send Negroes to the Continental Army where the service was longer. You had to serve outside the state, and you had to serve where the action was rather than within the state, you see. And the Continental Armies, not able to get anybody else, were glad to get the Negroes that were sent by the states. So the Negro got into the American Revolution because of the shortage of manpower, and then because of the principle of substitution. Down to the 20th century, we always had the principle of substitution. If you were drafted, you did not have to go if you could get a substitute. Now, we don't like to talk about substitution because we are so brave in America that we are just anxious to get at the enemy. Yes, we don't talk about desertion or substitution. That's unpatriotic. But frankly, everybody's looking for a substitute. I mean, really. So that where do you turn? You cannot get others to be, but you can get a slave to be a substitute by promising him his freedom. So you turn to slaves, promising them that they will be free to take your place. This happens even in Virginia. In fact, in 1784, the Virginia Assembly had to pass a law that any Negro who served in the Virginia Army had to be free, because the master was bringing up his slave, saying, this is my substitute, a free Negro. Then after the war was over, the master wants the slave back. And Virginia actually had to pass a law in 1784 saying that if a Negro served in the Virginia Army, he was free, because he was supposed to have been free before his master brought him there. So that Negroes got into the Revolutionary War on the principle of substitution. You could furnish a substitute if you didn't want to serve. Now, it's estimated that some 5,000 Negroes served in the American Revolution. We will never have figures because they served in integrated units, as we would call them today. There were no separate Negro units. Sometimes we can tell by the man's name, or if he had one name, if a man had one name, invariably he was a Negro who just had one name as a slave. Negroes like to give themselves names which had liberty in it. So if a man's name had liberty, Pomp Liberty, you can almost be sure that was a Negro. If he had Jupiter Freedom, you know that would have to be, yes. And, so that the historians of the Revolution judge a great deal by the roster, and when they come across certain names, because white people were very fond in slavery of giving Negroes high-sounding names like Chloe, and names out of Greek mythology, Jupiter and Caesar, yes, and Cicero. Yes, so that there's nothing like Jupiter Free. That's actually, some of these are actual names, of course. And then sometimes the name would simply be Negro, name unknown. The Negro was anonymous, but he was there in the American Revolution. So in the very revolution that gave America its birth, we are a nation out of this revolution. The Negro is there. Now, this isn't something apart. This isn't something for a Negro audience. I mean, this should be for a Negro audience. What we're talking about is the heart of America. This thing that the Negro does when he fights for America, he's fighting for himself, change his status. He's also fighting for the things which are American. These protest groups, however they may be distasteful to us, they are fighting for an image of America. You say, they're fighting for the Negro. No, this group is fighting for an image of America, which is part Negro and part something else. They're fighting for an America. So we meet the Negro in the American Revolution as a participant.
We have been listening to Professor Benjamin Quarles speaking on the Negro American. This series of broadcast was produced for station WDTR by the Department of Educational Broadcasting for the Detroit Public Schools. Executive producer, Frederick E. Schoen. Technical direction, Clifford Weir.
This